Chapter 8. Counterculture. My job was done, but I was glad. The plastic world was not for me. The only people I'd found who seemed to understand and welcome me as me were those in Haight-Ashbury, those of the new culture, the counterculture. They had found the world crooked and perverted and had dropped out of it except for their protests against the Vietnam War and pollution. "Make love, not war," they shouted. That sounded good to me, and I found myself more and more into the hate, more and more into the new culture and drug culture, more and more into the new morality. One girlfriend continually counseled me, "Quit playing games. Come on over to the other side." My first step to the other side came when I met Michael. He spent a lot of time in the Haight, but lived in a big house overlooking Muir Beach, a few miles north of the Golden Gate. "I need a housekeeper," he said to me one night with a grin. "Why don't you come with me? It's a free area. You'll like it." I moved in with him and immediately set off on a big trip, nature and drugs. It was all there. Earth, sky, and sea, plus lots of dope. Everybody in sight was a dope head. The house sat on one of the cliffs framing the beach. Down below, there were little cottages sitting close to the beach itself. Michael was fine for a while, but we eventually grew tired of one another, and I moved in with a guy at the other end of the beach. But I didn't confine my favors to one man. I had by then decided that no one man could keep me happy, either with sex or with other mental and physical stimulation. I kept looking for that one place, but nothing lasted. I ended my Muir Beach stay with John, a carpenter. He fell in love with me and was rather pitiful about it. He asked me to marry him, but I knew he wasn't for me. One night we experimented a heavy hallucinogenic drug that was new to me, STP. It took me beyond anything I had known. I lay on the floor and, as though I could see inside myself, I surveyed a massive battleground right within my chest and stomach. I couldn't distinguish one from another, but spirits or some such force battled and clawed and screeched within me. Before long, the increasing numbers of spirits spilled over to my exterior and battled and raged all about me and upon my skin. I screamed, "John, John, oh God, help me, it's good and evil. They're battling in me. Help me, please. There's the good and there's the evil. Oh, John, help me, they're killing me." John stroked my forehead and kissed me all about the face. "It's all right, Susan," he said softly. The screaming eased into moans and groans, but my body twisted and squirmed. John fondled me all over, seeking some way to bring me through this terrible turmoil. He gently removed my clothes and began to make love to me. I finally quieted, and the hour of horror passed. Again, John asked me to marry him. I lied and told him I had to go ask my father. Instead, I went straight to Haight-Ashbury in search of a life I could lead. "Hey, Susan!" Standing alone in front of the drugstore was one of the Haight's better-known hangouts. I turned in the direction of the voice. It was an old friend from Los Banos. "Barbara, what are you doing here?" I said. It was exciting to see a familiar face. Barbara was a good-looking brunette, about my age, but not the kind I'd expected to find in the Haight. I remembered her as a straight kid, right off a Los Banos farm. "I've been here quite a while," she said. Everything else was a drag, but things are happening here. "I know," I said. "It's one of the few places where I feel comfortable." Me too. And I've got a great new family here. You'll have to come over and see them. What do you mean family? You're not married, are you? Heck no. This is another kind of family. A real one. We all live together and take care of one another. I've got an old man and he watches out for me. How many of you? 11 right now, she said. Some come and go after a while. We figure a dozen is about right. 6 couples. Someone's missing? That's right, Barbara smiled. Bob needs a woman. He's my man's partner. That's Tom, the head of the family. I see. There's a pause as we watch the people go by. Why don't you come on home with me? Barbara asked. I want you to meet everyone and see our house. It's great. Sure, if you think that's right. No problem, Barbara said. We have a lot of visitors. The family's home was a big 2-story brown house at the corner of Oak and Lyon Streets. It was an impressive old home in the midst of several impressive ones. The area had passed its prime, but still maintained a certain elegance. Janis Joplin lives over there, Barbara said, pointing to the house next door. There are a lot of great people around here. We entered the brown house, and Barbara took me up 1 flight of stairs to the big room, the living room, where I was about to have my first encounter with Charlie Manson. Dominating the room was one guy who turned out to be Tom, Barbara's man. He was the head of the family. I stood in front of him, and he smiled at me. He was sitting in front of a huge hookah pipe, dragging periodically from the long, flexible tube that passed through the water. The best Acapulco gold in town, he said as I stared at the contraption, which was right out of an old Errol Flynn movie about the desert sheiks. I smiled. It looks good. It was a strange scene. Rock music was playing in the background, the Jefferson Airplane. Every man seemed to have a woman, except for one. That must be Bob, I thought. He smiled at me. We spent the next 2 hours talking and smoking grass. It was as good as any I'd tasted. Before long, I was talking exclusively to Bob. He told me a lot about the family. Each man in the group was a dope dealer, moving some of the highest quality drugs in the country out into the streets of Haight-Ashbury. The girls were often used to go out into the streets and hand out samples of the latest batches as advertising. Of course, he explained, they used a lot of the drugs themselves. They shared everything in common, except for the girls. As sleeping partners, they were monogamous, following the developing hippie lifestyle. Bob eventually asked me to accompany him to his room. We made love there, and from then on, I was his woman. For 3 weeks, I was constantly loaded on hashish, marijuana, or acid. I was fulfilled for the first time in my craving for dope. There seemed to be an endless supply. One of my favorite pastimes was sitting, stoned, on the front balcony and listening to Janis Joplin playing, singing, and boozing. Other times I would just sit watching the trees and the birds, and then the steadily increasing numbers of young people finding their way to Haight-Ashbury. There was even the time when we picked up word that the FBI was watching the house. Not only were we heavy into drugs, but we also were militantly active in the peace movement sweeping across the youth of the land. Once we knew, the agents were easy to spot. Many times I sat on the balcony listening to the radio, waving at them from time to time. That seemed to panic them. But there was one sunny afternoon when I, again, was stoned on hash, and my serenity failed to hold steady. I had many moments like that, but that afternoon was especially difficult. Despite the excitement around me, the apparent love, the sex, the drugs, despite my family, I was lonely. The afternoon was warm, but the old familiar chill of loneliness moved up and down my body. It was far deeper than tears, a fullness in the throat and chest. I'm still an outsider. The thought rushed across my mind over and over. Bob likes me for sex, and the others put up with me because of him. But they don't like me. I'm too weird. I'm not like them. Barbara and Ella accept me, but that's all. I listened to the street sounds for several seconds. What's wrong with me? Won't I ever belong? First my own family, then Al and all the others, and now here. Can't I find a place anywhere? Things suddenly slipped out of control when the police and the federal authorities intensified their pressure on us. My man, Bob, was arrested for selling drugs. Tom was immensely obsessed with the desire to free his partner, and that required considerable money for lawyers, fines, and related activities. It was early afternoon when Tom and I went out onto the street. We immediately knew we were being followed. We crossed the Golden Gate Panhandle, and when the way seemed momentarily clear, we separated and I began a big circular swing back toward the house. Tom was to keep moving and hide out for a day or two. I would be in a position to come with help if he was caught. I was breathless as I shut the door of the old brown house behind me and stood for several minutes listening to the music. A man's voice coming from the big room upstairs. I climbed the stairs slowly and stepped into the dusky room. Seated on the couch in front of the bay window was Charlie Manson, playing a beat-up old guitar remarkably well and singing in a clear but soft voice. The shadow of your smile when you are gone will color all my dreams and light the dawn. After listening to Charlie sing and talk, after dancing with him and making love, after sensing and seeing the power of his mind, I knew I would go with him if he asked me. I felt fully responsible for my actions, but at the same time, I knew there was something inside me that was attracted to something inside him. I knew I had never encountered this before, and I knew I had to have what he had. I was 18, but older inside. I was free. My father, brothers, and I were irreparably torn apart, it seemed. I had come close, but so far had found no substitute. Charlie had instantly seemed more of a father to me than my own father. It was obvious from the way those girls, Lynn, Pat, and Mary, followed him that he could lead. He could make things happen. If he were the head of a family like Tom, there would be no falling apart. He would know how to keep it together. He could make one for all and all for one work. He not only preached love, he had power. What he wanted, he could get. He often sounded like God. When Charlie said, "Come on, we're going to LA," I was prepared. It didn't take much to talk to Barbara and Ella into going with us. Chapter 9. On the Move. By the time I joined him, Charlie Manson had spent more than half of his life, 17 of 32 years, in institutions. Although I knew virtually nothing of his background, he had only recently been released on March 21st, 1967, from federal prison. Over the previous 17 years, he had served time as burglar, car thief, forger, and pimp. According to Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, Manson had begged the authorities to let him stay in prison even on the day of his release. It would become his home, he told them. He didn't think he could adjust to the outside world. His request was denied. He was released at 8:15 a.m. on March 21st, 1967, and given transportation to Los Angeles. That same day, he requested and received permission to go to San Francisco. It was there, in the Haight-Ashbury section that spring, that the family was born. This quote is taken from Bugliosi and Kurt Gentry, which is Helter Skelter, on page 146. It should be noted that for some reason in Susan Atkins' book, it is quoted as Hater Skelter. By the family, Bugliosi was referring to that steadily enlarging group of young men and women which began to gather around Charlie, starting with Lynn, Pat, Mary, Barbara, Ella, and me. Charlie was born, no name Maddox, on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, the illegitimate son of 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox. The only possible identity available for his father is Colonel Scott of Ashland, Kentucky, the target of a bastardly suit filed by Kathleen in 1936 in Boyd County, Kentucky. The court awarded her a judgment of $25 plus $5 a month for the support of Charles Mills Manson. Later court actions indicate that Kathleen had trouble collecting. Following is an excerpt from Bugliosi's findings regarding Charlie's very early life. According to her own relatives, Kathleen would leave the child with obliging neighbors for an hour, then disappear for days or weeks. Usually his grandmother or maternal aunt would have to claim him. Most of his early years were spent with one or the other in West Virginia, Kentucky, or Ohio. In 1939, Kathleen and her brother Luther robbed a Charleston, West Virginia service station, knocking out the attendant with Coke bottles. They were sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary for armed robbery. While his mother was in prison, Manson lived with his aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia. Manson would later tell his counselor at the National Training School for Boys that his uncle and aunt had some marital difficulty until they became interested in religion and became very extreme. A very strict aunt who thought all pleasure sinful but who gave him love. A promiscuous mother who let him do anything he wanted, just so as long as he didn't bother her. The youth was caught in a tug of war between the two. Paroled in 1942, Kathleen reclaimed Charles, then 8. The next several years were a blur of run-down hotel rooms and newly introduced uncles, most of whom, like his mother, drank heavily. In 1947, she tried to have him put in a foster home, but none being available, the court sent him to the Gabalt School for Boys, a caretaking institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 12 years old. Along the way, Charlie landed at Father Flanagan's Boys' Town after it was erroneously reported that he was a Roman Catholic. He stayed only 4 days, breaking out with another boy and finally committing his first armed robbery at the age of 13. From there on, it was in and out of one institution after another, all across the United States. Reports on him over the next 19 years painted a picture of a young man with a marked degree of rejection, instability, and psychic trauma, heightened by a sense of inferiority in connection with his mother, by his small physical stature, and by his lack of parental love. Others found him to have homosexual and assaultive tendencies, safe only under supervision, criminally sophisticated, headed for serious difficulty soon, young, small, baby-faced, and unable to control himself. An almost classic textbook case of the correctional institutional inmate. One who hides his loneliness, resentments, and hostility behind a face of superficial ingratiation. An energetic, young-appearing person whose verbalization flows quite easily, who gestures profusely and can dramatize situations to hold the listener's attention. The records showed that Charlie had married at least 2 women and had fathered at least 2 boys before I met him. They also showed a deep but temporary involvement with a number of religious sects, including Scientology, Buddhism, and many Eastern religions. He was described as knowledgeable about certain portions of the Bible and Christianity, and it was in prison that Charlie developed his musical ability, the guitar playing, the singing, and the songwriting. He took himself so seriously as a musician that he was described as jealous of the monumental fame that flowed to the Beatles in the mid-60s. It was this Charlie, the balladeer, the self-made philosopher, that I was learning to know as we wound our way toward Los Angeles in 1967. We picked up a hitchhiker, Scotty, as we approached the Los Angeles area, and he invited us to his place in Malibu on Topanga Canyon Lane. We pulled up the big bus up in front of his house, which we very quickly named the Spiral Staircase House because of its stairway. Topanga Canyon, a surprisingly steep and rugged area above Santa Monica on the coast, just off Santa Monica Bay, was fast becoming a hippie haven, at least in its southern portion. Large numbers had established communal living in the houses on both sides of the canyon, winding south to the ocean. Topanga Canyon Boulevard was the main thoroughfare running north and south. Topanga Canyon Lane, where Scotty took us, was a little curving road at the southern end of the canyon, leading down to a cluster of small beach houses. Scotty's house was midway along this lane, with houses on each side and across the street. We had no sooner arrived at Scotty's than a spontaneous gathering developed, with about 40 or 50 people, including us, and a big acid party was underway. It came right on the heels of our bus experience with Charlie. People were all over the house, on couches, chairs, the floors, upstairs, downstairs. Records were playing one after another. The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Dylan, and lights of every color tinted the walls, ceilings, and floors. Someone even presented a light show on one bare wall. Again, I was in my customary position during the heavy stages of a trip, prostrated on the floor. My arms were stretched out, and I sensed I was on a cross. I have to die for all these people, I thought. They don't know it. They don't know I'm dying for them. People were everywhere, doing everything imaginable, and I was inside them. I was with every person there. I love them, I said inside myself. I love them so much that I want to die for them. But they will not know it. It doesn't matter. I love them. As this sense slipped away and I was aware of myself on the floor, I yearned to see Charlie. I wanted him to share this experience, but I couldn't see him as I wandered from room to room. Everyone was tripping in a dozen different ways. I eventually wandered out to the bus. Charlie was there, alone. He was dressed in a long white robe. I immediately knew that he might be God himself. If not, he was close to him. He held a pan of water in his hands, resting on his lap as he sat on a pile of pillows. "Susan, love, I'm gonna wash your feet." "No, Charlie, you can't do that," I said softly, yielding fully to the realization that this was a deep spiritual moment. "I'm not worth it." "Susan, you are beautiful. You are perfect. You are one with God. We're all one with Him. I must wash your feet. I must show the way." I sat on the floor of the bus, and he rolled over onto his hands and knees and washed my feet, Right in the middle of the washing, a tall, rugged, auburn-haired guy came into the bus and watched. Charlie looked into my face and said, "Now you must wash this brother's feet." Without hesitation, I moved to my hands and knees and washed the feet of this giant of a man whom I didn't know. He merely stood, looking down at me, unsmiling, completely solemn. He looked as though he might weep. Others began to arrive in the bus, men and women, perhaps a dozen or 15. The next thing I knew, people were making love all over the bus in every possible way and position. Bare bodies were everywhere, some pale and soft, others hairy, bony, and tan. It was a full-fledged orgy of the kind I had heard about, but had never witnessed or participated in. I made love with the big auburn-haired fellow, but as I did so, I was, in a flash of light, aware that I was once again inside all those people. I was inside them, even inside the auburn-haired guy. My God, I screamed inside myself. I'm making love to myself. All consciousness and awareness of my individual self slipped away. I had no idea who I was, only that I was in total oneness with everyone in that bus, indeed, everyone in the whole world. Who am I? The voice yelled deep inside my bowels. I don't know who I am. Then a voice said, "You're everyone. You're with everyone. You're in everyone." All sense of being slipped away as I abandoned myself to the man whose feet I had washed. LSD and marijuana were the center of our lives at Topanga Canyon Lane. I was losing my individuality, my identity, more completely as each day passed. It was an evolution that I welcomed as I sensed a oneness, a togetherness with others. But with this loss of individuality came what seemed to be an increasing contradiction, a craving for attention from others, especially Charlie. And he did not give me attention to the degree I was begging for. There was a hug here, a smile there, with no dependable pattern. But he had me hooked. Several times he took me aside during my petulant moods and repeated his earliest line with me. "You are beautiful and perfect. You must accept yourself. You must love yourself." Somehow he knew of the insecurities within me. I had terrifying moments of feeling very ugly inside. He knew this. And during those frightening moments, he was there. In my manic moments, he shot needles at me over my desire for the spotlight. "You just want to be the queen bee," he said. Both forces, seemingly opposites, played within me, and he watched them keenly, as he did with the peculiarities of all his girls. We were in Scotty's house in late afternoon, a few days after arriving. Charlie took the floor, as usual. "The thing we must understand," he said softly, pacing the floor, "is that the past is over. There is no past. It is dead, severed. In fact, there is no time. Get rid of your watches. You don't need them. There is no time." The room was silent. Mary, Ella, Pat, and I, with some new girls and guys, watched every move Charlie made. He had talked a lot since we had left San Francisco, but this was on a new level of intensity. He was serious, and we knew it. "Now listen to me," he said, raising his voice and slapping his palms together. "Yesterday is dead. Tomorrow never gets here." He looked around the room. His eyes were on fire. Do you understand that? Yesterday is dead. Tomorrow never gets here. We live in the eternal now. He stopped walking and stood in the center of the room. All your roots are cut, he said, lowering his voice again. You are freed from your families and all their old hang-ups. You are cut loose into the now. You are free. And because we are free, we can become one. The Bible says we must die to self, and that's exactly true. We must die to self so we can be at one with all people. That is love. We all felt we understood that, and several heads nodded enthusiastically in agreement. Smiles were on several faces. Out of those lectures by Charlie came constant actions aimed at ridding us of our inhibitions. One of the most used techniques was the one he had used on me about making love to my father. Don't be afraid of that, he said. Pretend you're making love to your father and get rid of the inhibition. Another technique growing out of that was the use of orgies to break down inhibitions. If we were hung up on any aspect of sex, he would lead us into group activities aimed at shattering those hang-ups. In fact, it seemed to many of us that Charlie pushed the orgy concept too far. Quite a number had come out of the hippie lifestyle where monogamy was far more prevalent in sexual relationships. Most of the men were growing beards and long hair, and several of them were quite attractive. The women were young, also growing long hair, in fact, giving up even the shaving of underarms and legs. Natural, free, those were the bywords. Clothing trended toward blue jeans or work pants, t-shirts and other inexpensive, earthy attire. The women were more varied. Sometimes we wore blue jeans, other times extremely short miniskirts. Still other times long old-fashioned dresses and skirts. It wasn't long before we began to share clothing communally, on a first-come, first-served basis. Everything was washed together, and we took what we wanted for the day. It was obvious to all that one of Charlie's plans was to use his attractive young women to lure men to the group. We weren't talking about family at that time, but that was the direction. Hundreds of young people were on the move throughout California, and the promise of lots of sex and dope was enticing. One of the most attractive men to show up during this period was one who gave Charlie a run as a leader. He was Bobby, an outstanding guitar player with an unusual ability to motivate young people, especially women. He arrived on the Topanga Canyon scene one day with his own following of girls. He didn't tie up with Charlie permanently then, but came and went throughout the whole period, with his stays increasing in duration. Music was important to Charlie, and so was Bobby's talent. In fact, Charlie often used music as a device to break down our lingering inhibitions. Come on, he said. You can do anything you want to. You can sing. Shake all the past and throw yourself into it. We did become more moderately accomplished, most of it singing behind Charlie, who was obsessed with the belief that his music could change the world. From Scotty's house, we moved into a rented house farther up into Topanga Canyon. Several people were coming and going from the group, and our numbers were increasing. But the core consisted of Charlie, Mary, Lynn, Pat, Ella, myself, and 3 or 4 others. Pat and I were quite close during this period, and I even adopted part of her name to become known as Patty Sue. She in turn became Katie, a name that was to stick with her. One night in the rented house, we were high on grass, and for some reason the women and the men were momentarily separated. In a stoned condition, I looked at Charlie across the room. The men were clustered around him. I counted. There were 12. In his lengthening hair and beard, his eyes stared intently from face to face. He looked like Jesus, talking to his 12 apostles. The thought simultaneously startled and thrilled me. I felt he might be Christ. Highly mobile at that time, we traveled all over Southern California in Charlie's school bus, which we had by that time painted black. We stayed in the bus or with people we'd strike up friendships with, or in the woods, and we soon made our first trip out into the desert, Death Valley. Charlie was fascinated by it. "This is part of our return to the land," he said. "We've got to get back to the land. We must learn how to live off the land." Hardly impressed by the endless wasteland, I merely shrugged my shoulders. "It's okay to live off the land, Charlie," I said to myself. "But the desert?" Then, with no clear explanation, we had no explanations for the things we did in those days. We agreed we should go to Florida for the approaching winter. Charlie wanted to go, and we were with him. So off we headed toward the southeast. We got as far as Texas. There, Charlie's teeth began to bother him. He was in great pain, both from receding gums and deterioration from the use of drugs and lack of proper care. "I've got to get help," he declared, grabbing his face with both hands. We went in at the first hospital sign in a little Texas town and drove to the emergency entrance. A doctor said it seemed to him the only situation was to have Charlie's teeth pulled. Charlie was like a little child. "You can't pull them," he whined. "I'm a singer, a performer, and I've got to have my teeth." He prevailed, and the doctor shrugged his shoulders, giving him some medicine for the pain. That was the end of the trip to Florida. We turned back and roamed around New Mexico for several weeks, stopping off in a little college town and attracted considerable unpopularity. We were a weird gang in an even weirder black school bus. In Arizona, we were caught in a snowstorm, forced to halt for several hours and then to move slowly and wearily westward. Charlie, hurting from his teeth, went into a deep depression that no amount of care and concern from us girls was able to lift. The next morning, he announced to all that he was leaving the bus to hitchhike back to Topanga Canyon. "I can't take this anymore," he said. "The rest of you stick with the bus and come on back as quickly as you can." The next day, we were still getting practically nowhere. I was fed up too, and I talked to one of the guys, New Bruce, as distinguished from Old Bruce, an earlier family associate, into hitchhiking back to California with me. When we arrived back at the house, Charlie flew into a rage, swearing and yelling at me and coming very close to striking me for having left the others. "Don't you have any loyalty?" he screamed. "What about the others? You just left them out there alone, maybe to die? Who in the hell do you think you are? I told you to stay there." I tried to hold my ground, but I was too frightened to say what I was thinking. "Fuck you, Charlie," I roared inside. You can go jump off the cliff. You left, didn't you? You're no better than the rest of us. So I left. What difference does it make? Things were cool for several days between Charlie and me, but it passed after the others made it back with the bus. So life resumed in Topanga Canyon for Crazy Charlie and his girls. We were increasingly unpopular with the hippies because we lacked any sort of code at all, especially sexually. They saw Charlie as a strange little guy who's exploiting a gang of attractive, wild, young girls to feather his own nest. Even in Topanga Canyon days, most of us had been busted by the police several times, and we were on parole. We were always in danger of being picked up for anything, from vagrancy to drug possession and more. We need new IDs, Charlie said, and before long, who should arrive, fresh from prison, but Randy, a master counterfeiter. Seeing our problem, he agreed to make new driver's licenses for everyone. When he got to me, he asked what name I wanted on it. I don't know, I said, but don't make it Sharon. I've worn that one out. Suddenly, Charlie said, "She's Sadie Mae." Sadie Mae? I exclaimed. That's right, he said persuasively. That's the perfect name for you. Sadie Mae what? I pressed on. But Charlie was silent. After a moment, Randy said, "Glutz." He and Charlie roared with laughter. That's it, Charlie said excitedly, still laughing. Sadie Mae Glutz. What are you guys laughing about? What is Glutz? After a pause, Randy explained. It's a prison term, Susan. You know, Joe Glutz, like Joe Smith. We used to call the guards Glutz. So there was Sadie Mae Glutz, a name that I could rattle off in perfect Arkansas accents when questioned by the police. I'm Sadie Mae Glutz from Arkansas, and I'm just thrilled with your California. Strangely, it seemed to work. Other names awarded at that time were Jaime Hobsnopper, which was Charlie, Katie B. Everglad, Patricia Krenwinkel, Ella Beth Cinder, Ella. And someone even reached so low as to take the name I'm Fibbin. Some avoided bad puns, adopting names that were to stick in many cases. Squeaky, Gypsy, Weesh, Little Patty, Sandy. One day, a group of us were picked up for vagrancy by the police outside Los Angeles. We were sitting in the courtroom when the bailiff began to read off names. The judge, a woman, started laughing. This is like a fairy tale, she said. The cases were dismissed. It was just after our move into a second rented house in Topanga Canyon that I discovered I was pregnant. Conception apparently occurred during a trip to Phoenix by New Bruce, Mike and me to visit Mike's parents, who were wealthy and socially active. They put us up in the city's leading hotel, and for several days we engaged in a luxurious, high society binge of fancy clothes, the latest hair fashions, the best food available, and one party after another. My lover on that trip was New Bruce. Charlie flew into another rage over how we had backslidden into the world's way when he saw us with good clothes and groomed hair. Can't you guys get it through your heads? You've got to break once and for all with that plastic world. It's doomed. I was the second woman in the group to become pregnant. Mary gave birth to a boy, Pooh Bear, in Topanga Canyon, which delighted Charlie more than any single thing in that period. He was radiant over the fact that I was going to have a baby. "We want lots of babies," he said. "They're the kings of this world. Completely uninhibited and free from all the garbage of society. We can let them grow up free. Free from the plastic world. They won't even have to go to school. They'll learn in their own freedom, and even how to talk." His eyes sparkled, and his smile grew wider and wider as he watched Mary's baby.